kéré o, wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa, àwọn ọmọdé wọ̀nyí kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa. Wọ́n kéré sí nọ́mbà wa.
Not because I suffer fast, not because I pray and fast. No be your show, no be jazz. I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, I'm no qua Osinachi. One name man Osinachi, I'm watching. Daily Osinachi, mama Osinachi.
Hello. You're wondering where. Good afternoon.
Hiya.
How are you? I'm Tommy Adetayo.
In Vienna.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You're wondering where the others are.
They should be here. It's 3:00. Here's the Oga, the celebrants.
And the co-conspirators are also
Conspirators.
They're showing up slowly. Hi, Tayo. How are you?
Good afternoon, Tommy. How are you?
Fine.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, panelists. How are you all doing?
I'm fine.
Very well, thank you.
Thank you.
Greetings from Nigeria.
Rotimi. Hello.
Professor Baba.
Have they?
Ọjọ́ mẹ́ta mà.
Ọjọ́ kan pẹ̀lú.
You're in Nigeria.
Yes, I am.
Professor Adeko, good evening.
Yes, Adeleke. Adeleke.
Yeah, do you hear me?
Yes, and I can see you.
Okay, good. Thanks.
Okay.
Good morning to everybody. Good morning, Professor Baba. Tayo.
Good morning. How are you?
You don't know our names anymore. What?
I do now. That told me idea. Come on.
It's afternoon in the UK.
Otherwise, you
Professor
pay
Baba.
fine.
Yeah, it's
for
3
it.
p.m. here. You.
Ẹnlẹ́, Professor Fasan ṣé dáadáa ni o.
Àlàáfíà ni sà, ẹ ṣeun sà.
Ẹ mà kú ìlú o.
Ìlú wa nìyẹn o, ẹ ṣeun.
Ó ga.
So where is Tanuri actually?
I don't know. It's
Which time zone is he in right now?
He's in Nigeria too.
Oh, okay. Are you all seeking refuge there or what?
I know. I think yes, he might be joining in.
If he's in Nigeria, yeah, maybe. Because it's already 3 p.m. Nigerian time. Leke, would you probably like to jump in for him for a few minutes before he... I can't hear you. Adeleke, we can't hear you. Huh? What's wrong with your mic?
I'm just
And can probably Professor Fasson lead us before we, so that,
Okay.
yeah, we can move on.
Yes, then good.
Okay.
So to the panelists, good afternoon once more, everyone. Professor Baba, Professor Adeaga, and Professor Adeleke Adieko. Yeah, for this afternoon's panel, we'll be looking at Adetayo Alabi's Oral Forms of Nigerian Autobiography, a recent release on the Routledge stable. For our panelists, I think we have about, for this session, we have about an hour and a half. And I'm thinking that maybe we can agree on this. Maybe for each presenter, we have about 10 minutes. So thereafter, we can have some time for the rejoinder from the author and then the participants. And without wasting much time, then I want to call on Professor, I think, okay, Professor Adeaga.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I am very much honored to be among the esteemed members of this roundtable, just to honor our colleague and friend and the work that he has done to, the new addition that he has brought into the into this discourse on Nigerian oral literature. So, well, I'm Tomi Adeaga, and I lecture at the University of Vienna. And yes, that is it in a nutshell. So I just have a few points that I have outlined for this for this roundtable, with the hope that we will be able to talk a bit about it at some point. So let me start then. Adetayo, yeah. Can I go?
Yes, please.
Okay. Adetayo Alabi has joined the long line of African griots, chroniclers of past and current events that document the lives of African people. Alabi's timely book interrogates oral acts and forms of Nigerian autobiography stories. Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay.
Please go on.
Yeah, Tanure Ojaide said in his article entitled Examining Canonization in Modern African Literature that the renowned African writer Mazizi Kunene finds African literature heavy compared to European literature. Indeed, African literature is heavy because it carries the weight of oral literary traditions. African literature is demonstrative and adapts to new socio-cultural realities. And these developments are also extensively explored in this book. When I say new realities, that means talking about oral literature and also bringing in the religious aspect of it. Something which, of the society, something which was formerly sort of like separated from such discourse. So this is something that I find innovative on the part of the author. So this book, a product of several years of research, demonstrates the author's interest in connecting the dots in past oral traditions of the Yoruba and Yoruba people in the Delta part of Nigeria. The author also highlights the work done by eminent scholars such as Tanure Ojaide on the poetry of the Yoruba people. So the question that the reader might ask at this point is, where is the connection between the Yoruba people and Yorubas my understanding of this is that they're linked by the Oriki recitations of the Yorubas. I may be wrong, but I suspect that there's more to it than that. Traditions be preserved for future generations? Should modernity be allowed to erase this aspect of the Yoruba oral tradition and culture? As a Yoruba person, I was not even aware of the fact that there's something called bridal chants among the Yoruba, as I read in the book. I was quite surprised that it ever existed and that it is still being practiced in some parts of the Yoruba part of Nigeria, where the Yoruba people live. Maybe the reason behind my lack of knowledge of this is because, like most Yoruba people these days, I grew up in a Christian family where such traditions have been replaced with other, religious, say, gospel songs, for example. So finally, the part of the book that focuses on the renowned Nigerian poet and author Miyo Shindari, how Yoruba oral traditions form the basis of his rich poetry is quite insightful. Oshindari's deep relationship with the Yoruba oral narrative traditions reinforce the need for a more nuanced approach to oral Nigerian and African literature, because without this powerful connection to his roots through his apt understanding of his own cultural traditions, his poetry would have been bland and uninspiring. That is it in a nutshell. I hope there will be more discussion.
Thank you very much, Professor Adiaka. I think our Shia is around now, yes. Professor Ojaide. You're welcome, sir.
Yeah. And I
thank you.
Have a question for you too. So
I want to apologize for coming late. I'll be trying at UI. If I were at home in Abuja, everything would have been okay. And the university has no Wi-Fi. I have to figure my way out. So I apologize. And yeah, I'm happy everybody, those who should be here are here. And so, Tommy, you've presented already. Have you presented? Yes. Okay. So who?
Yes, I presented, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to make a few remarks at the beginning, but since we started, the book, I read the book before it was produced, after it has been produced, and it does the work to me, with like what is the Okwego did, how you cannot find them. And so Professor Alabi is trying to say that we can define autobiography in many ways, and it doesn't need to be the way it's defined by one culture. And since this book is about literature and culture, see, literature is a cultural production, and most of these things, so he has redefined it, that he has expanded our understanding of what the autobiography is, life stories and so forth. And it's a detailed book, which I've read. I'm also in the book itself. So he wrote about me in the book itself. And so it's a pleasure to share this thing. I have a lot of things to say, but I'd like everybody to talk. And later during our discussion, I can even put in my own ideas and also hear what you've said. So I think we go to the next speaker so that we have time to discuss among ourselves, and others will ask questions. If not, I have a lot of things to say about the autobiography itself. And I will want to ask him at some stage how he got all those confessions from witches and wizards and so forth. Okay, so who is next in the order of the schedule?
I think that's Professor Adetayo.
Okay, so Professor Adetayo, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I can hear everybody.
Great.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
all right. Good morning, where I am, and good afternoon to our colleagues in Nigeria. It's my pleasure to be here, like Professor Ojaide. I read this book in manuscript. Also read it after it was issued. I'm going to be more critical than Professor Adiaga, and I hope Professor Alabi will take this in the spirit in which I speak. I've known him for a long time, so if he doesn't like what I say, too bad. We'll meet at other places and we'll talk about it. The central engagement of Professor Alabi's scholarship, I broke it down into two because I've been following his interest in autobiography for a long time. One, theoretical implications of Africanist literary conceptions of the self for understanding modern Black experiences in the Atlantic sphere. That's one central issue in Alabi's oeuvre that I've read, especially his two books. Two, is also interested in rigorous research into mechanisms of the self in Africanist oral and written traditions. That's the second main element I've noticed in his work. The one genre that brings these issues together for Professor Alabi is the autobiography. His earlier book on this topic, Telling Our Stories, is a comprehensive study of Africanist life writing, quote, with representative texts that cover different time periods, spanning the era of slavery to the post-apartheid period, from Mary Prince to Nelson Mandela. That's what you'll find in his first book. That book, again, the autobiography there. That book argues that while collective responses to slavery and colonial subjugation in each autobiographer's local environment circumscribe the histories of, quote, communality and resistance depicted, constantly evolving ideas about the individual organize the perception of history in the stories told in each book. Alabi's account of how each author manages the tension of, and you'll see that again, it comes up again in this book, Alabi's account of how each author manages the tension of, quote, communality and individuality. Communality and individuality repudiates the long-held view that the power of the community to dominate the individual is the main identity marker of Black autobiographies. Let me repeat that, the power of the community to dominate the individual is the main identity marker of Black autobiographies. He proposes a replacement view that insists on the denominative capacity of the community, that instead of dominating, that actually we should focus on the denominative value, the naming, what the value of the community in the formation of social and literary subjects. That's what I found. That's my summary, my understanding of Alabi's main claim, both in the two books. In that first book, Alabi shows that at no point in history does the sense of communality, allegedly drawn from overpowering oral traditions, handcuffed individuality in Africanist autobiographical selves. That's what I understood him to be saying in that book, which a project he continues in this second one, that at no point in history does the sense of communality, allegedly drawn from overpowering oral traditions, handcuffed or disabled individuality in Africanist autobiographical selves. That's a major claim we should all follow and we should all listen to. Where the first book theorizes written self-accounting. The new book, the one our main topic today, Oral Forms of Nigerian Autobiography, points at new pathways of thinking about unwritten, quote, unwritten self-accounting, and develops an argument for expanding studies of reflexive self-conception to include originally oral, often subaltern, generally allusive poetic forms. That's what I found mainly the text it focused on. Self-conception, originally oral, often subaltern, generally allusive poetic forms. The book documents extensively and as well creates a foundation for the study of self-expressivity in verbal and performance art of Southwestern Nigeria, where the Yoruba constitutes the largest population and influential culture, although the national language, English, dominates everyday exchanges, including newer oral autobiographies. No longer the unstable, inherently evanescent performances that traditional orality study constitutes them to be. These forms I found in Alabi's book are frequently transcribed and distributed as printed texts. They have also enjoyed popular acceptance in commercially available recorded electronic formats, digital apparatus, electronic formats ranging from radio to bulky analog recording to the most sophisticated digital apparatus. Many literate poets, literate in quote, have also turned to the traditional forms for aesthetic rejuvenations in the different languages in which they work. Nigeria remains the main focus. The book affirms the abundance of discourses of the self, abundance of discourses of the self in African oral traditions. The book also contends that the wide-ranging ramifications of these discourses ought to be significant factors in how literary scholarship construes the individual in autobiographical studies. Alabi concedes that the texts analyzed may not be autobiographical in the Western sense of distended ruminations on a social subject's coming to an awareness of acute individuality. The theme of self-differentiation, he insists, cannot be mistaken in what he calls oral autobiographies. The more obvious positioning of the analysis against received notions of self-writing will not be the main book's attention from critical scholars. I do not believe the position in the book against received notions of self-writing will be the book's main claim to scholarly readership. In my estimation, its core contribution proceeds from the discussion of continuities, despite unrelenting, oftentimes radical changes in concepts of the self in Southwestern Nigeria. In Yoruba language, Alabi proposes Ori, the head, in literal terms, but also apex, essence, source, peculiarity, terms that I wish he had explored further in relation to Ori, is the figure of the inimitable self. Ori, Alabi proposes in Yoruba language, is the figure of the inimitable self for which autobiographies, oral or written, account. This is the root subject, argues, in nearly all poetic genre of self-fashioning: panegyric, bridal chants, hunters' guild chants, witch hunt, witch confession, and even self-aggrandizing academic pursuits. Ample textual analysis, including transcripted radio interviews of youngsters accused of witchcraft, we'll talk about that soon, Wedding Eve chants of a university professor by Halima Ateleshi, texts of verbalized elements of Ierefa from Wande Abimbola and William Bascom, texts of verbalized elements Uje song or dance performances, extensive illustrations from Anglophone written poems by J.P. Clark Beckerderemo, Tanure Ojaide, who is here with us, and Niyo Shindari, and sections of a full-length reflective novel about the Black self in post-enslavement United States. So the book covers a lot of evidence. A lot of evidence is mobilized to substantiate the main argument that I said earlier, summarized earlier, about the head as the source, the Yoruba concept of the head as the source of individuation. Well, whether it is right to put the use of language in the poetry of Niyo Shindari, Ojaide, Tanure Ojaide, and Clark Bekederemo in the same category of tradition attributed to underage, self-described witches and evangelical witch hunters is another question on which I will punt the ball for now. Both in conception and organization, Alabi's book creates a new problematic as a way of, I'm saying that as a sense of a project of discovery, the way I use problematic here, in African literary criticism. Pardon me, I will, okay, I think I should finish now. I should finish soon. I will spend the remainder of my presentation on interrogating that problematic, which we may, for the sake of convenience, call autopolygraphy or autocommunography, or account of how the social collective denominates the individual. Account of how the social collective denominates the individual. Alabi should have let biography alone. Nothing substantial is gained in my reading of Alabi's book by pointing repeatedly at the shortcomings of standard issue theories of autobiography and bind the form inextricably to scriptocentricity and individuality. In allegedly Western autobiographical studies, the lived experiences of the written subject is not as important a consideration as the processes of intextuation, that is to move doubly away from the society and into the text, that results in the isolated, unique self that is the outcome that the book reports. If that is what they say autobiography truly is, why not let their bygones be their bygones, Professor Alabi, as we say in Nigeria, and focus on the evidence that autopolygraphy reveals the case to be. Susan Anderson's notions of the proper autography are quoted and called out as wrong more than one time. But Africans, admittedly, more white Africans do write such autobiographies, I believe. But that is not my main concern here, Professor Alabi. At any rate, Eurocentrism has been very, very productive. The question for me is this: for whom do we have to struggle so much to demonstrate that the skillful hunter of elephants and baboons, sung about in the Njala chant, is a biographical subject, and why? This question subsists even if the chanter is also the referent hunter of the chant. That is a general question I look forward to discussing with the forum at large, and not just with Professor Alabi. Many theologians still discuss whether the idea of supreme God exists in Africa. Many wonder whether the epic is African. I've never read any critic wondering whether the sonnet is Oriki, or whether the sonnet can be Oriki. I think it could be in many, many ways. Actually, many sonnets are Oriki. They just don't call it that. That takes me to the next question, and it concerns the difference between writing, speaking, singing, listening, and hearing. Does it not matter to analysis of Yoruba language text that the sung and the written text are both expressed as ko, roughly to inscript, kori, kowe, or is this just a case of polysemy? It may be, but that conclusion in my thinking ought to be the outcome of some further extensive analysis. My next observation addresses Oriki, the Adaje type, I'm calling it Adaje type, of which you may say constitutes the central engagement of Professor Alabi's book. Alabi ventures a bold definition of Oriki as denoting the panegyric dimension. I'll be done very soon, Professor Jaidi. The panegyric dimension of the question of praising the head, following his breaking of the Yoruba compound word, Oriki, into two meaningful parts of Ori and Ki. Isaac Delano renders Ki as Yesi, bestow honorable recognition, and saw Orirun, recount a source in his Atumoide, the only Yoruba monolingual dictionary. Some other scholars render Oriki as defined. All these translations see in Ori not just the head, literal, metaphoric, symbolic, some sense of privileged space that recalls a high point. This is perhaps the reasoning behind Karim Baba's characterization of Oriki as the basic intertext of Yoruba poetry long ago. All I'm trying to say here is that the gains and losses beginning with the source text prior to comparative analysis. Is Oriki a genre? That's the final question now, and I'll shut up. Is the Oriki a genre or an effect? Is the biography a genre or an effect? I don't have an answer to offer here, but I can say that Alabi's highlighting Iwuri, an idea that first came from Adeboye Babalola, might put us on a productive path. It should be worthy of investigation that the physical presence of the addressee is necessary for Iwuri, especially that the poetic lines are typically broad. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Adeko. Yeah, we've heard him. I think we take up these things, and the forum we take up these things later. I'm just coming from a meeting of the Pan-African Conference with Neil was there, Femi Oshofison. I'll be arguing about some of these terminologies, whether the African, does African culture define its own, or we use the Western canon, established notions of things in the Western canon. So maybe we'll talk about some of this later. So the next question, if you could use about, I hope 10 minutes, not too long, of 12, so we can have a lot of time to discuss some of these issues being raised. So, Professor Rotimi Fasson.
Okay, I thought Professor Baba is next. Should I go on?
No. You can go on. She can. I hope you can. Yeah, you can go on.
All right, then. Thank you very much. And good afternoon,
aim at
everyone.
about 12 minutes. Yeah.
All right, then. I have a piece here that I would like to read, but before I go into that, I want to say that for me, reading this book threw up a lot of questions for me. And some of what I've written down here are in forms of, I conceive as a way of thinking aloud. And I'm hoping that by the time I'm done with this, Professor Alabi will be able to shed more light and guide me into the right direction in terms of my own understanding of some of the things that's written down here. So I will quickly go to my piece. So I start by saying that Professor Alabi's work is more or less a rejoinder to Western and Eurocentric notions of autobiography as a written and basically individualistic genre. And he makes the counter argument that the autobiography doesn't have to be focused on the individual alone, but it could also be extended to the community as well as being oral. And of course, I consider this to be a very powerful argument. For in fact, there are some societies with limited access to alphabetic writing, but nevertheless, they have their own modes of reading other than the oral. To that extent, I think I will agree with Professor Alabi. Then I see his book in 10 chapters as snapshots of the different genres that are analyzed in this work. Because I'm aware that there are some other more substantial texts that deal with some of these individual genres that he has treated. Some of them he referenced in his own research. I'll give the example of Adeboye Babalola's The Content and Form of Ijala, for example, and Karim Baba's I Could Speak Until Tomorrow that is focused on Oriki. And then even Gigi Dara's Battle of Song, which looked at the Uje tradition. And finally, Christopher Waterman's Juju, the social history and ethnography of African popular music. These are all different research that have actually looked in more detail at different genres that Professor Alabi looked up in his work. And then, of course, with appropriate background information on each of the forms that constitutes the spectrum of his generic classification of autobiography. And more importantly, his expanded definition of autobiography to include confessional accounts of witches and wizards. The author's argument serves as a salutary counter to the universalist and absolutist claims of writers like Susan Anderson and James Olney, and even, in fact, Walter Ong's own over-celebration of writing. So it has to be said that some African societies have other forms of literacy and are literate in other ways. There's the Eurocentric appropriation of autobiography by the likes of the scholars referenced above echoes claims by early missionaries of the Yoruba country, as chronicled in Adeleke Adeyeko's Art of Being Yoruba. I'll quote, there is a reference in Adeleke Adeyeko's Art of Being Yoruba where he supports the claims of Bishop Charles Phillips, who condemned the attitude of Christians who tended to look down on local Ifa worshippers, rejecting their Ifa system, looking down on it as a kind of oral form that has no basis. But as Adeleke Adeyeko goes on to say, his characterization of the Ifa discourse as revolving around writing is in consonance with Bishop Phillips' own account. And I quote now, representation of the storytelling elements of Ifa divination infrastructure as an instituted, durable signification system. So in a sense, it is a form of writing, different from the alphabetic writing that the Western society is more, celebrates. So one of the more elaborate discussions of this book, that is Professor Alabi's book, centers around his discussion of Oriki. It should not be surprising because P is a very ubiquitous form of Yoruba oral form. For someone like Olatunji, for example, it describes Oriki as the most popular of Yoruba oral forms, whereas Karim Baba calls it the master text of Yoruba oral forms. So, for the fact that Oriki intersects other genres. The spiritual essence and physical attributes of Ori are analyzed in terms of their symbolic and religious significance for the life of the individual in Professor Alabi's own work. It is from these that the idea of propitiating or chanting or singing its praises in form of Oriki emanates. Chanting individual praises in this manner reveals the autobiographical contents of Oriki, according to Professor Alabi. And as he is constantly at pains to make clear, the genre of Oriki, as are the other forms discussed in this book, is not limited to the individual, nor is it only to be found in the written form. It can and is often oral and extendable to the entire community, which takes us to the realm of Oriki Orile as opposed to Oriki Nishoki, which Olatunji calls one-word Oriki. These and many of the other forms are carefully identified and articulated in oral forms of Nigerian autobiography and life stories. Certainly, one of the more remarkable expositions of Professor Alabi's work is his inclusion of witches and wizards' confessions as autobiographical genres in their own right, with all the implications that this may have for the way we theorize genres and, of course, literary forms. If, for example, Susan Anderson can, arrogate the impulse, and I quote now, can arrogate the impulse to examine the history of the self, to turn systematic introspection into art to the West and Europe, then the self-rendition of supernatural tales and confessions in the moments of exorcism can be seen as an art form in which some African communities excel. In other words, when an African or someone is said to confess in the sense in which it is understood in Africa, we can see that too as a kind of art in its own way. And of course, this is different. This is different from the type of confessions we have from the confessional poets that we have in Europe or in America, generally in the West. People like Sylvia Plath and Sexton and Robert Lowell. Their own modes of confession or their engagement with the personal and their confessional is of a different quality and temperament from the types chronicled in Adebayo Alabi's own work. Nor are the wishes and wizards of Alabi's study the same as those to be encountered in magical parlors, enacting the kind of Harry Houdini's own tricks. So perhaps it is in Alabi's attempt to cite and explain autobiographical elements of the forms of his study that I have some concerns. And my first point of observation in this regard is in its category of autobiography, which appears to require more explanation in my view, in terms of the sense in which he deploys it and in which it is to be understood. According to Alabi, for example, he relies on the dictionary definition of autobiography and the sense in which some Eurocentric scholars and writers have described the form in conducting his own research. That sense seems to me to require some more elaboration for me to get it further. That these definitional issues appears not to have been fully resolved, in my view, explained, or gives me the impression that the autobiographical elements of the forms and stories analyzed in oral forms of Nigerian biography, or that which makes them autobiographical, have not been fully accounted for. The examples cited of Oriki, for example, in poetry, or the juju music of Sonny Ade and others, do not provide enough details of their subject. They seem to be one-off reference, or have focused on just an aspect or a single episode of their lives. Is each of these to be seen as autobiography in the basic sense of an extended account in prose of an individual's life as written by them or by others in the case of biography? An autobiography, an autobiographical reference. Yes, I can consider that to be an autobiographical reference. But can I consider that to be autobiography? I'm not too sure of that. Can one really equate the story retailed by Pastor Adeboye as provided on page 142 to 143, for example, about him and his half-brother as an autobiography or an autobiographical reference? These are questions to which I will appreciate some answers. Even the Confessions of the Witches and Wizards, which is one of the more fascinating aspects of this book for me, I find that they are more of recollections of the encounters of some of these personalities than the actual or the direct confessions of the witches and wizards themselves. And Alabi's study from any other types, left at this level, in which every such self-referencing is seen as autobiography, there might be nothing left, or maybe very little, to separate the autobiographical forms of Alabi's study from any other type of oral accounts rendered by an individual. So I will need some more clarification in terms of how he has conceived the autobiographical in his own research. So in my own view, I think one way to overcome this definitional issue is by identifying, to see the autobiography first as an adaptation of the novel or novelistic writing, which comes to us in several forms, whether in thriller, epistolary, or sci-fi, or historical form, which come closest to the autobiography. We should, if he conceives of the autobiography, looks at it from the novelistic tradition, perhaps there will be some more clarity to the views that I expressed here. Viewed from this angle, then, it will be clear the sense in which Susan Anderson and other Eurocentric claimants of the autobiographical form are to be understood, if that sense will seem to deny the evolution of the novel from earlier prose forms, to which every society, including many from Africa, is a claimant, prior to the 18th century, when it became the form celebrated in Europe, or especially in England. An autobiography, in my view, following from this, is a form of history or extended narrative based on the life stories of an individual, which undercuts the claims of those who arrogate that form of writing only to the West. Autobiography, as we all know, shares some of the features of prose fiction, including the question of length and the fact that it is built around the different experiences of an individual's life that are connected to different events, not just one. As some of the examples we have in oral forms of Nigerian autobiography will seem to suggest. What seems lacking, therefore, in the examples we have in oral forms of Nigerian autobiography is that story element, what I call the story element, which is connected to the length of the stories, or Oriki is cited. Oriki is by its very nature not narrative, but it has a backstory, or iton. That is a story that is behind it, which is often referenced, not often referenced clearly, except someone has some information about the background. Iton is a different genre that is male-dominated, as opposed to Oriki, which tends to be the province of women. Iton, or story, provides context and elusive resonance for Oriki. Once the iton behind Oriki can be told, it will take care of the question of narrative duration or length that many of the examples in oral forms of Nigerian autobiography appears not to have. Even the confessionals will become full-bodied accounts of equal length, as the modern novel or autobiography once the story or iton behind them can be fully told. As Adetayo Alabi himself observes in his introduction on page 5, and I quote, "Arrival at a particular location on the way to a farm can trigger the memory of an older relative to start a storytelling session about how a town was formed and roles of the progenitors in establishing that town's civilization." It is this type of stories triggered by memory that the examples of Oriki that we have in oral forms appear not to have. But his autobiographical references, whether in Oriki, bridal chants, and wishes and withers confessions, need to be fully autobiographical narratives. The rise of capitalism and its promotion of the individual and individual subjectivity over and above the collective experience separates the novel from early forms of narratives, while at the same time giving it its autobiographical form. Is it any surprise then that the earliest and most influential novels of the 18th century, from Daniel Defoe's own Robinson Crusoe to Henry Fielding's Tom Jones, were centered around lone figures and were thus initially viewed as biographical accounts of the life of real persons? With the so-called digital turn then of the 21st century and its adumbration of oral, written, and visual elements, the human society might be making a gradual or partial return to its oral origin, which will put an end, hopefully, to the apparently unending debate between oral and written modes of expression and the assumed superiority of one over the other. I thank you all for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Faso. We'll discuss these things, a lot of issues you've raised about whether some of the points that Professor Alabi brought are elements of autobiography and so forth. But you're going back to 18th century British literature. It gives me some concern about definition of what autobiography should be. That's for something else. Let's hear from Professor Karim Baba, and then we discuss before we give, we make the writer to respond. So, Karim Baba.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, everyone. Ọ̀mọ̀wé Adetayo, ọmọ Ìláwẹ̀, ọmọ ọba tí jẹun nínú tangaran, ẹ kúṣẹ́ o, ẹlẹ́.
Thank you, ma.
So it's a pleasure to be invited to comment on this book. And what struck me immediately about it is that it's an outward-looking book. First of all, I saw that it's in a series called African Diaspora Literary and Cultural Studies. So it's oriented outside Nigeria, or not exclusively to a Nigerian audience. And in the final chapter, Dr. Alabi describes his experience of bringing Yoruba Oriki into the classroom. And this is a classroom that actually includes the American classroom. So it's to do with making these issues, these texts, these questions accessible and open to a wide audience. So it deals with some very complex and very intense, compacted oral genres, but it does so, I would say, in a friendly and inviting kind of way. So that's the first thing, it's open. If it's open to readers, I'd say it's also open and inclusive in the genres, the types of material that it looks at. So as we've already heard from other panelists, it's based in established scholarship in the classic about all genres, Eseifa and Oriki, including a really good look at some well-documented Oriki-based genres such as Ekunyawu, bridal chants, and Ijala, which are variants or manifestations of the basic Oriki material. But it doesn't privilege these classic, well-documented forms over much more contemporary manifestations of this tradition. So I particularly enjoyed the Oriki for coronavirus, which the book quotes having found it on Facebook, or the different nicknames and the oriki of a former governor of Oyo State, which she found in BBC Yoruba. Use of oriki by Sunny Ade and other popular music lyrics. And then also included, as you've also heard already, discussion of self-representation, or a highly mediated self-representation of witches and wizards' confessions, because it's not really them telling stories, it's the Pentecostal pastor relaying the story of how he elicited their confessions. Then, of course, we have the Urobo Uje poetic contest, so brilliantly documented by Gigi Dara and by our chair. Salutations to him. And of course, discussion of two of the great Anglophone Nigerian poets. So it's a very varied menu. And it's also very generous in the sense that each dish in this menu is served up in very big portions. We get long texts to pour over. Some of them are transcriptions and translations produced by the author himself, which brings new material to the research table. So I particularly enjoyed this long performance of a bridal chant by Mrs. Halima Eleshi Ajikubi, and the transcripts of Pastor Adeboye's rather alarming exorcism narratives. So there's a lot of new material here, which was not formally available to read in print form in the public domain. And I have a comment on the way some of these texts are presented in the book in a moment. But first I want to say that trusting these texts to speak across cultural divides and trusting that readers will be able to enjoy them, make something of them, engage with them, is something that's all too rarely seen in academic discussions of oral and popular genres. So I like that. I like the fact that we were being offered this delicatessen, this smorgasbord of material, and being invited to get on with enjoying it. But this material, this fresh and classic material, and these interesting juxtapositions of different types of genres should also provide food for thought for specialists, as well as students and newcomers to the field. First of all, just it's such a great theme. I mean, verbal genres that embody expressions of the self, self-conceptions, self-representation of the individual, but the way this is always imbricated with those of other people and in communities, conceptions of the personal life course, of fortune. I mean, these are topics of inexhaustible interest. What is a person's life? How is it recalled? How is it depicted and recounted? What counts as a successful life? How do people narrate their own and other people's experiences? So this is interesting in any culture, in every culture. But in Yoruba, it so happens that one of the really important central genres, oriki, are all about these questions. Oriki exists to explore these questions. Oriki are about what makes entities distinctive. And when it's persons who are being made distinctive, it's always done in relation to kin, to town, to origin, to other people. So that's the central thing, which, as you've already heard from other commentators, is the real crux, the nexus of this book and this discussion. And I think attention to the genre of Oriki in itself should be enough to debunk the simplistic generalization that Africa always thinks communally and that the communal is somehow in opposition to the individual. Because Oriki show with incredible subtlety and flexibility and sophistication that the individual is made up of ties with people, and that also collectives generate distinctive individuals. So the two things are inseparable. What's so distinctive about Oriki is that individuals are evoked through assemblages of illusions. As Rotimi just said, they're not sequential narratives which tell a life story. They're assemblages of moments arising from diverse incidents, utterances. Some are unique to the subject, some are applicable to whole categories of subjects, some are transferred from one subject to another, some are composed by the person concerned, others, many others, by other people observing and commenting on them. But the thing is, all these things from different sources, different moments in time, different points of view, different perspectives, are concatenated into, they're fused together into a high impact, high intensity poetic performance. So this is a conception of what makes up a person, a reputation, a life representation that's far more complex than can be captured by shoehorning it into the category of European autobiography, which tends to presuppose that an individual is endowed with unbroken memory and privileged knowledge and is sole author of his or her own narrative. So we're looking at something much more complex than that. So I'd say this is a foray into a fascinating set of questions and materials, but I think that the book could have pushed these explorations further in a few ways. First, I think I've commended the variety of different genres and materials, but I think it would have been interesting to hear more about what are the differences, how do they operate differently, why do we have all these different genres representing personhood, and contrasts be better theorized rather than just putting them all together. What makes them different and distinctive? And to do this, I think it would have been rewarding to pay more attention to textual form, to how these different genres constitute narratives or representations of lives, because different genres do it differently with different effects. They propose different views of personhood and self. So looking more closely at addressivity, the textuality, and the genre would be another step which the author may wish to take in future explorations. Finally, I come back to the issue I hinted at earlier about the presentation of the texts. Do I have one share? Yeah, very good. First, I noticed that your presentation of translations was variable. So some texts are presented in English translation only, very long transcriptions in Yoruba only with just little English summaries. And so there wasn't a consistent attitude or method regarding translations. But that wasn't what bothered me. What bothered me more was that your use of tone marks and subdots in the Yoruba texts was haphazard, to say the least. And this is a pity, because as a major globally spoken language with a defined orthography that was finalized more than 50 years ago, Yoruba deserves to be well presented in its best dress, and full diacritics make the text more easily understood, including by students who may be learning the language, but also by specialists, because these texts include a lot of rare, specialized, elusive idioms and unusual vocabulary. So unless you've done some research to establish what these terms are, you may easily not be able to identify them. So please give us the full Monty, the full orthography. And we need to put pressure on publishers like Routledge and others to develop their capacity to copy edit. They didn't copy edit your text, copy edit, typeset, and proofread African language texts. And if they don't have that capacity, they need to develop it, and we need to hold them to it by our own practice. Otherwise, to quote H.G. Wells, we're pointing to the glories of Yoruba orature, but smudging the picture with the very finger we're pointing with. So having said that, I want to say again that I found this book fresh, engaging exploration of a very deeply fascinating and rewarding dimension of African orature. So thank you.
Thank you, so Barbara. Yeah, you emphasize the new materials, how fresh they are, and how this has done a lot. But of course, you talk about the Yoruba spellings and so forth, which I tell you are supposed to have done better in that aspect. So I don't know. They were supposed to ask questions from outside. I don't see any questions yet.
But can we ask questions
And
ourselves?
so I don't know whether we should discuss this before giving, before giving Professor Tayo the opportunity to respond. I will say a few things also. Yeah, please, Dr. Adiaga. You can ask a question.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's been a fascinating discussion from everybody, and it's been quite enlightening for me, and it also raised the different presentations raised some questions for me, which I hope we will be able to answer, and maybe the author himself might be able to shed some light at the end of the day. So I first of all want to comment on Professor Adeko's issue with, I think Professor Adeko, I won't take too much time, Professor Adeko and Professor Faso actually touched on the role of biography and autobiography. My sense is that I fully agree with Professor Baba said about if I got it right, applying, trying that we should try not to apply Western rules to rigid rules to things to such texts that are Africa-centered texts. So why, my question for the two of you is, why does this book, or why does this book or the author necessarily have to focus to adhere to the so-called Western guidelines on autobiography or biography for that matter? Is it really necessary? Who defines it? Because literature itself is not static. It evolves all the time. So who says that the author cannot choose a certain form to deal with this, or because we're dealing with oral traditions? And I don't think they're so, the rules are still very, very well known today as to how to define what how to go about using oral materials. So that is
question. Yeah, I think we are closing at 4:30. We need to be brief so that we have enough time to allow him to respond.
Yes,
I don't know.
so just
you
one
can
last,
say that,
yeah,
but,
just one last comment. I'm talking about the issue of translation that Professor Baba raised. Being a translator myself, I'm being confronted with texts that in my critical work that need to be translated from one language to the other. I quite understand the difficulties, some of the difficulties he may have had in doing that. So it is not as easy as it seems for the author to actually get everything right to the satisfaction of everyone. So it is something that, yes, it takes time, and it also takes a more like a professional person to take a look, a professional translator, to take a look at that aspect of the manuscript, which is something Routledge, for example, or the publisher actually could also do, not just the translator. Not just the author. So this is just what I wanted to mention. Yeah.
So, just 1 minute, if you can.
Oh, I would have loved to listen to Professor Alabi first, but I think that the question raised is easy. I didn't argue that Alabi should shoehorn African biographies into. All I said was that these are not biographies, leave them alone. Let's call it something else. Why do you have to call it biography? That was my point. Not that I didn't make the point that I was not arguing that what he did was wrong. What I'm saying is that call it other things. Why do you have to worry over time, explaining over and over to these people that we have biographies? To those who don't care, anyway, in the first place. That was my point.
Yeah. You see, you notice that he used the word life stories too. So that's not necessarily with life story. And let me explain something in Uje, which I think will clarify the Uje side a little more. See, in Uje, you sing about yourself first before you sing about others, before the society. And if you look at the great singers of Uje, the great singers, Memeruma, Oloya, Okitiakwe, by the time you've gone through about 7 songs, you've almost got a good picture of their lives. They sing about themselves. They talk about their weaknesses, their strengths. So I agree with you that maybe this is, sometimes you get information in fragments and you assemble them. They're not, there are so many elements in different places, you assemble them to form a story. I could tell a story about Memerume, about a lawyer, about Kitiakwe, from their stories which I have. So like every need to be just at one blow that you are so focused on this. The other things there. I want to also draw attention to this idea of the self and the community, which he talks about a bit. Even if you read even Ake, even in English, more modern. So Shoika pays a lot of attention to the community, you know. So it's not really telling the story of himself alone, but I think a good autobiography or memoir or anything of that sort should show how that society has propelled him or her, the self, how it has conditioned the self to be what it is. When you read Ake, it's later on the women's movement and all those rebellion against tax, they become so important that that he grew up in that area and absorbed the climate of the time to become what he is today. So I don't know, I'm just reflecting on my own. I was not in his mind when he wrote this, but like the stories. And the question about maybe we answer them where is when we use the, I think the word genre could be used in a very liberal way. I would say J. It's an oral poetic performance genre. Oriki would be the same, or Ijala, I would think, but he will answer that. And does the group, I think we give the floor to him to respond, and then we continue. Maybe you respond for about 10, 15 minutes, 10 minutes, then we gather again, then we have the final word with him. So what do you say with all these disparate views of your work? And what do you have to say?
Well, let me start by thanking all of you on the panel for reading the book and for engaging with it. I really appreciate your taking the time out to read and reflect on it and offer your comments and suggestions. I really appreciate that. And I appreciate our colleagues also joined us from various parts of the world to participate in this in this panel. Thank you so much. You raised a lot of very, very important issues in relation to the book. I will try to address a couple of them. I wrote several of them down. I will try to address a few of them, or as many of them as I can within the time frame. One of the questions is about orthography and the diacritics on the Yoruba words in the text. Sometimes the issue was, it was a little difficult to have all the transcriptions come out clearly at the proofreading stage. So I had to agree to take out some of them, and some that I did not want to take out, especially words that were not contextually understandable. I insisted on putting the tonal marks on them. And some others, because of the availability of English translations, I did not have to worry too much about them. But I agree with the premise that the tonal marks should be on the Yoruba words. That's the first and foremost point that I think we need to make about the spelling of Yoruba words. And wherever it's possible, we should do that. Some of the circumstances may not make them to be easily, but whenever we can do it, let's do it. And let us use that as the right way to go. One of the questions that Professor Baba kindly raised, she recognized my hometown, Ilawe Ekiti, which she has visited a number of times. And I know some people who know you in Ilawe too, who have told me about meeting you in Ilawe. She raised the issue of the comprehensive nature of the various genres that I assembled in the book, and asked whether I can differentiate between them and talk about the differences in relation to the genres and how they propelled itself. I think that's very significant. Some of these differences come in the text, but I agree that another chapter talking specifically on each of the genres and differentiating between and among them in relation to that would be a pretty good addition to the book, which is an addition that I can look into at a later date. And another point that Professor Baba made was to help answer the question by one of the questions raised by Professor Adetayo and Professor Fashion about the Western nature of the autobiographical genre itself. Professor Baba said we are dealing with several assemblages that are sometimes, and a lot of the time, elliptical. And so they may not necessarily fit in to the Western notion of the genre. And one of the things that I'm trying to do here is to say exactly that it may not, if we are looking for a one-to-one equivalent between the African versions of text about the self and the Western text of the self, we may not find exactly that, because there are lots of differences. And then Professor Adetayo talked about why worry about the autobiographical genre at all. That's a question that I've been asked repeatedly by different people. In fact, when I started this project several years ago, that was one of the top questions. Why don't you say, choose a different word, a neutral word, and start theorizing that word for the African or the Yoruba self? I said that's a very good point, but I'm not doing this in a vacuum. I'm doing this in a relation to some other things that are in existence. One of the books that I teach regularly is Art of Darkness. Almost every time I teach the book, I say I'm not going to teach this book again because it's very depressing. But I pick it up again because I also want to leave some words for people who may not have the opportunity of listening to somebody who has my own background to talk about that particular book. And so I keep returning to it to show that there are lots of things missing there that we can find in some other texts. So we still have to engage with the terms, and some of them we have to redefine, obviously. And that is one of the things we are trying to do with a book like this, to redefine some of the terms and suggest that there are different ways of looking at some of them. One other thing about Nemi comes to mind, one other thing that comes to mind is Ngugi's idea of the language question in African literature. He wrote brilliantly, as all of us will recall, he wrote brilliantly in English, and all of a sudden decided he wasn't going to write in English again, and that he was going to engage only in Gikuyu. And he did that. He was able to draw a lot of attention to Gikuyu and other African languages because of his existing investment in the English language. And now he writes in all the languages that is very familiar with, Kiswahili, Gikuyu, and English. So if we are able to theorize and discuss the autobiographical content of our own texts, of our own stories, then we can proceed from there and do something else about naming. One of the things that I also need to mention is one of the panelists, a couple of the panelists mentioned this before. One of the reasons why a project like mine is possible is because of the brilliant works that some of our senior colleagues and scholars and poets like Karen Baba, who is with us today, Adeboye Babalola, who we've cited before, Professor Tanuri Ojaide, who is here with us today, Professor Adetayo, and so on, because of the work they've done in all these areas. And we are looking at them and moving the discourse forward in newer directions, paying attention to the groundbreaking achievements of several of these our colleagues and senior scholars. Now, one of the other questions is the connection between the Yoruba and the Urhobo traditions there. I've asked that, I've had to answer that question. One of the reasons why I insisted on putting the UJ chapter there, apart from the fact that I have a number of Urhobo mentors and people who people taught me some of these traditions, is the fact that the various African Nigerian cultures share more in many of these literary productions. We share so much, and what colonialism and politics and all that have all been trying to do is to show differences and not similarities. And so I wanted to show that the idea of self-reflexivity is not local to only one nation within the Nigerian nation states, that it goes on in all the other ethnicities there. And I wanted to show that there are differences, but these various ways of reflecting on the self can be found across Africa. And this again negates the argument by somebody like Susan Anderson that I quoted in the text. Also, how can we preserve the Oriki genre or these oral traditions? I think we are a little luckier today than before. A long time ago, anytime I was traveling for research for this project and other projects that some of our panelists have advised me on and they are aware of, the first thing I pack to show me that I'm traveling is my camcorder and then my camera. Today, I don't even know. I can't remember the last time I used one. I just make sure there is space on my iPhone. So technology has been able to help us in the preservation of this. And I talk about this a little bit in the concluding chapter of the book. One of the chapters that seem to attract a lot of attention is the chapter on the witches and wizards confessions. When I started this research initially, and I had a lot of people who didn't believe what I was saying. And I had to think that there are different ways in which we've conceived of the self in these different parts of Africa. And not all of them are necessarily positive. There are some that are not necessarily positive, but we have a lot more edifying traditions like the Hunter's chant or the Bridal chant. And there are some that we can also be very critical of, like the Witches and Wizards Confession. The Witches and Wizards Confession chapter was the most difficult chapter to write because the evidence was substantially cryptic. And one of the advantages actually that I had in unraveling that chapter was the advantage of technology, because I could sit in my home in Oxford, Mississippi, and watch different programs going on in different parts of Nigeria and stumble on some of these confessions, or read the newspapers online that document several confessions. And then there could be some concerns, especially about the ages of some of the children that were reflected in that chapter. But I still kept those voices there because the children believed what they were saying, and the adults who were their guardians also believed them. And also, we can still put it in perspective that we are hearing from much young people, and then there are stories, comparable stories from older people that we can use to corroborate these texts. And Professor Adeaga said she was surprised the Bridal chant was still there. Yeah, that was how I was surprised at a lecture in Kwasu when I mentioned this issue and started talking about it. One of the students, Professor Adeaga, was there that day. Our dear friend, departed dear friend, Pius Adesami, and departed dear friend, Tejo Laniyan, were also there. They were sitting outside the classroom. And when LSA and Jacob started performing, Pius Adesami actually left where he was and came to see what was going on, because the class became a lot more interesting because the people could relate to the stories and to the text that she was chanting. And then there was that very important question about the Yoruba music chapter, that there were lots of snapshots there, that they were not detailed, that the storylines were not very developed. That's correct. That's the way it is. Because when the poet writes, or when the poet talks, whichever the context, he or she cannot tell the whole story. In my book, Telling Our Stories, Continuities and Divergences in Black Autobiographies, I had a chapter on the autobiographies of creative writers. I discussed Wole Soyinka's Arcade Years of Childhood then. It was a pretty good story. long, very well developed story. And also in that chapter discussed Derek Walcott's autobiographical collection of poems, Another Life. Walcott was at his best as a very cryptic writer in that text, but I was still able to decipher the autobiographical component of that text and be able to conclude that, unlike Soyinka, who was interested in a community of Yoruba people, and beyond that, the primary community that Walcott was interested in was a community of artists and writers. So we can get these snapshots and these picture-like representations and still be able to assemble the storyline, but it is different from fiction. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Alabi. You want to say something briefly? I think we have to conclude, I think, because we have to end in about 4 minutes. But a good work normally generates a lot of discussion. If either we condemn the work totally or we try first, the work is excellent, that should not have been good. I think it's a good work is always controversial in some ways. And the point that a work for the writer, for Professor Alabi, his project is not finished. His project is not finished. And he knows that he can continue. He will do something else. It's not necessarily a chapter, another chapter in this. That book is made. You have to do something else beyond there. I've read some manuscripts for this Routledge of new biographies, and this is coming out soon. Maybe you have, they talk about place and time in them, about 2 or 3 of them, so that you will see what you've done. But I think what distinguishes what you've done is the idea of this orality as a text. These are oral texts, which are there. They are quoted the same way. So they're a text, and you'll be able to tell us how discourse from the traditional to the transformed modern, even in writing, in works of people like Niyi and myself. Yes, we have debates about this idea of self and the community. That's, we'll continue to have such things. But I think areas in which you have to improve, as you've been told, by those who know the language very well, as Professor Adetayo and Professor Baba, you know you have to work on that area, and you have to insist with the publishers that they must give you what you want people to read, because in the end, you can't complain. Routledge did this, no, it's your work, so you have no excuse. But for me, I feel it's a good work. It's a very good work. It's a bold work, a work that attempts to do what others have not done. You are bound to receive a lot of some criticism and some praises, but it's left for you at some later date to do something which will perhaps take the oral and the written together and have new ideas. So I don't know whether any of you, any comment? Well, some of you are Europe, Nigeria, Ibadan, Vienna, okay, Oshun, Oshogbo, perhaps. This one should be in Ado-Ekiti and Ohio State at Columbus. Any other word? So let's give you the final word. You have 1.5 minutes. Tayo.
The one more thing to say, in addition to what I've said, is that there's still a lot of work that we can do in relation to the oral aspect of our literature. And one of the major ways of even pushing forward the written literature is to return to the traditions of orality and see how these traditions of orality are even informing the written traditions. The works, the brilliant works that several of you have done before, as I said earlier, are the ones that are paving way for the ones that we are doing. And I hope that what we are doing will make us do more and provide a springboard for others to see areas where they can catch they can improve on and work more to improve our understanding of several of these cultures. These traditions are very elaborate and they are all over Africa. Let's find them and discuss them. And thank you very much for coming to this panel and for engaging with this text.
Thank you. Professor Jane Bryce sends greetings from Barbados. Is watching. And so I want to thank everybody for the discussion. And you know what to do. Your next project will go beyond what we've done so far. Go beyond the oral to the written and try to see whether you can frame a new theory or something to really bring them together. So I want to thank everybody. I apologize again. I'm at UI Guest House in Ibadan, and I have to have hotspots to be in this program. So I hope you understand. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank
Been
you
great
all.
seeing you all again after 2 years.
Huh? You say what?
It's been great seeing you all again after 2 3
yes. I saw your brother yesterday.
Okay, Raphael. Yes.
Huh?
At
Yes.
UI.
At
Yes.
King's Father's yeah.
Yes.
Okay, bye
Have to
everybody.
go.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
See ya.
Okay.
Bye.
Actually, have a good day. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.